This is Karen with newclevelandradio.net, and it is time for Heart Mojo with Melinda Smith. And Melinda, I think you mentioned to me that your guest today is going to talk about a subject that for some people is controversial, although I really believe that climate change is happening,
Right.
especially when here in Cleveland, we've had 90-degree weather for almost all of July, and that's just unheard of. So tell us a little bit about your guest, and let's get started.
Well, first of all, third time's a charm.
Yeah.
We've tried to do this a couple times, and Zoom had other ideas for us, but maybe it was supposed to be right now. I'm going to think that things happen for a reason, because we've had, I don't know how long out in the West. It's been well over 100 in Phoenix, and in Texas, it's been crazy. So this is our second in a series that we're doing for Zonta. Zonta is an international organization, 63 countries around the world. I'm in the Cleveland Club. Jane is in Minneapolis area. Jane Austen is my guest, and she's going to talk to us about climate change and how it affects women. Oh, I did the big no-no, forgot to shut off my phone. And of course, it doesn't want to shut off because this is why we don't edit, so you can see how the world works no matter how we do it. Okay, so anyhow, she's going to talk to us about climate change and how Zonta works with climate change and how it affects women specifically. I don't think we ever think about it from that perspective. But first of all, Jane, welcome, finally. And I would like to know a little bit about you before we launch into Zonta and how you got into Zonta and that kind of information so people know more about you.
All right. Well, I originally was invited to join the Zonta Club of Jamestown, North Dakota. I was living in North Dakota. I lived there for about 30 years. And after living in town, or actually just outside of town for about 10 years, the only person I knew was the veterinarian and the people I worked with. So I was looking for a way to get engaged in the community. Some other organizations we tried just really didn't fit very well or didn't work out. Finally, a colleague of mine invited me to join the Zonta Club, and I was really intrigued by the international perspective. But in the years since, I joined, I think in 1999, in the years since, I have learned so much about women's issues and both locally and how service organizations like Zonta give back to the community and also give back internationally and engage nationally. So I've been very fortunate to be engaged in Zonta for so many years. I've served in a number of positions. I'm now lieutenant governor for our district, which extends from the Dakotas and Minnesota down to Kansas and Missouri. And have gotten to know some really amazing women from all fields, all walks of life and experiences. I retired from my job as a research wildlife biologist in North Dakota about 5 years ago and moved to northwestern Wisconsin. Unfortunately, the closest club was the Minnesota St. Paul area, but I knew the women there. They're really awesome, and it's about a 3.5 hour commute. But thanks to Zoom, I can still contribute and participate in the Minneapolis club. I go down there a couple times a year and continue to stay active in Zonta, both at the club level, the district level, and also somewhat at the international level, especially with climate change issues.
Now I understand why climate change appealed to you with what you did for a living, right? That
Yes.
makes sense. So tell us a little bit about how what you see in climate change happening, and then how Zonta fits into that picture.
Climate change is such a huge issue. It's sort of hard to unpack it, but it is causing major changes around the world. And as an ecologist with my training, I've been aware of it for many years and really have seen it in how it is changing our patterns. Not just we're having warmer falls, changing the distribution of insects and diseases. It's causing thawing of permafrost in the far north that's affecting a wide range of species, as well as just how the systems operate. But as I've learned through both my work as an ecologist and now in Zonta, the impacts are just sort of cascading. And as one of the women I've worked with internationally is Carol Theobald from Perth, Australia. She's with the Zonta Club there. And she has put together a really great theme of, how to explain climate change. And she talks about it as a runaway train, where we've had increasing temperatures that in the air is where our greenhouse gases emissions are holding more and more heat in the atmosphere. It's warming our oceans, it's warming our lands. That in turn, all of those warmer temperatures are causing more extreme events. Warmer temperatures, just more extreme storms, because that warmer air and water can hold a lot more moisture in the air. And all of those extreme events and hurricanes, more extended droughts in places, is causing more and more social disruptions. People who are displaced because of a sudden flood or a long-term drought, whether it's very short-term or a chronic aspect, we're seeing more and more social disruption. It's affecting our food supplies. And in turn, those climate change impacts that are contributing to social disruptions are just amplifying any existing social inequalities we have, whether it's by your income, where you live in the world, but it also is affecting women, inequalities that women have already always had. In a lot of parts of the world, women don't own land, and yet they may be the primary food provider and farming person who you're bringing in crops or taking care of families. They have unequal access to legal opportunities or technology. They're certainly discriminated in many ways in terms of their access to other resources and to leadership positions. But one of the biggest issues that we see with climate change for women is how those social disruptions can lead to increased violence against women, which is one of the core issues that has always been really important to Zonta.
Right. We're going to have another show specifically about that violence against women, because Zonta, what we discovered when we spoke to Kim was we have so many avenues that we work in around the world that we have a show for everyone. So we are going to make sure we cover all of those.
Right.
So give me a little, dig in a little bit deeper and kind of give me an area that we're working in now that's seeing that extreme climate change and what we're doing to make a difference.
Yeah, well, one of the aspects, again, going back to the issues of violence against women, when we, had disaster like Katrina, severe hurricanes where a lot of families are displaced. Women are more likely to, during that event, they're going to be in crisis shelters. They're going to be in, like the big stadiums and areas where do you go on the short term, and also in the long term, you may be stuck in FEMA trailers for a while. But the studies have shown that the women who have been displaced in those displaced populations have as much a triple increase in violence against women in the year following the storms, because they are without their safe spaces. They may not have jobs. They are still caring for children, trying to figure out childcare, but they're experiencing more assaults in the years following a disaster and displacement and loss of their resources. And one of the key things that Zonta is trying to focus on is not only the short-term disruption. What can you do? How do you prepare as an individual or a family for having a bug out bag, for instance? Teaching people what do you need to be prepared if you've got a fire coming down your mountain, is threatening your home or your community. What do you need to take with you if you have 10 minutes or an hour to prepare? But if you are then displaced for the longer term, how do we ensure that our communities have the infrastructure and the planning and the policy that are set up, make sure women have the resources they need, either for the short term, again, at those crisis shelters, or longer term to make sure that women have the resources that are important to them, such as menstrual products if you're stuck at a storm shelter for a long term. are they in safe places overall? So disaster preparedness and seeking ways that we can work with our community to make sure those plans are going to include women specifically.
Do you think that, or do you find that it's, in underdeveloped countries, is it worse? I mean, we already go to a lot of underdeveloped countries and work with women there to help them get jobs, to help them be educated and do things like that. So in the United States, compared to other countries, how do you feel we are prepared with helping the public in general, but women particularly?
Yeah, in the United States, we're fortunate in many ways that since the 1970s, women now have more economic rights than they used to have. They can own land, they can have financial opportunities, they have access to technology for the most part, but they are still at risk for more episodes of violence and all of the stressors that go with that. Around the world, there's a lot of places where women don't have a lot of those opportunities and rights, where they have social, cultural aspects that they have expectations, or clothing expectations. They don't learn how to swim or climb trees, so when there's a sudden flood, they cannot escape, or they're unable to swim. They have when they're displaced, they're less likely to be able to maintain any source of income, but they're still, having to take care of childcare. So one of the programs that Zonta is doing internationally, and I guess one of the key things that Zontians are doing, and I think all citizens need to be doing, is educating ourselves, educating our communities, and other women and our children of what are the realities of climate change? How is it affecting our communities? How can we prepare for it, but more importantly, how do we prevent it from getting worse? And so one of the programs we have is in Madagascar, where it's been the northern half of Madagascar, a huge island off the coast of Africa, the northern half has been hit by extreme floods and storms, especially the past year. They had several tropical storms hit in a row. But the southern half of the island has been hit by severe drought. And yet, and it's also one of the most important biodiversity spots in the world. But the program that Zonta has put together in collaboration with the United Nations is to provide better education for girls specific to climate change that provides them the tools and the understanding that they need to be able to stay in school during those more climate impact events. They can stay in school, they can keep learning, but also they can work in their communities and be educated as part of their communities to make a more climate resilient community in the long term. So the Let Us Learn Madagascar originally was about making sure women were educated. Are you still seeing me?
Oh, yes.
Yep.
Okay. For some reason, my computer went to sleep. Hold on a minute.
Okay.
There we go. I'm sorry about that.
That's okay.
Yeah, in Madagascar, the program Let Us Learn was originally just for ensuring girls were able to stay in school and had good access, and now it's expanded to educating them on sanitation, clean water, improving the access to clean water and sanitation that then expands into the overall community. So as they experience more and more challenges with climate change, they still have sustainable schools, sustainable education, and more sustainable communities in the face of challenging conditions.
So I can understand there. I think somebody who might be listening to this saying, well, we live in the United States. So it's not as big of a deal here. We have services, we have those things. We have FEMA, people who come in to help. So when we're educating on this portion of the world, how are we changing what we're teaching? Does that make sense? Am I asking it correctly?
Yeah.
There, you've got a whole picture, and we had started with a different program, and it kind of morphed into bringing climate change into that. But here in the United States, we always think we can Google and we know everything. So how do we take a step forward to educate people? And there are the different parts of the country that respond differently to this type of education, like New York versus being out in Phoenix in the country part, out in the desert.
Right. Yeah, every part of the North America, for that matter, because Canada shares quite a few similar issues as we do, including extreme heat, forest fires, and so on, as we've seen throughout the United States. Part of it is, again, educating ourselves and our children to make sure that that how climate is affecting us in different ways. In Colorado, it's water issues and fire. California, it's water issues and fire. As you go further north, like where I live near Lake Superior, it's going to be changing temperatures, potentially increasing pests and diseases. May not be affecting women differently, but it's affecting farming families. Ways where it may have severe flood events, which can really take out areas like we've seen in the northeastern United States. So educating individuals to recognize what are the issues in your community, working in your community for disaster preparedness. And one of the organizations that Zonta has taken on at a global level is called Zonta Says Now for Gender Equal Climate Action. And the key there is action to prevent that gap in gender equalities from widening. We already know there are gender inequalities, and that's the key thing Zonta has always been working on. But we want to ensure that gender gap doesn't widen under climate change. And so through Zonta Says Now, we're trying to provide the tools to clubs and individuals to say, how can you make a difference? And the first one, of course, is educating ourselves. What are the great resources we can find? Sharing that knowledge with others in our community and our neighbors and so on. So we expand our impact. And also to start collaborating with other like-minded organizations where, as we work together, we have a greater voice. Of course, leading by example, providing the knowledge to our members to say, what can you do to make a difference? For instance, reducing anything you can do to reduce the use of fossil fuels, not driving so much, changing out from gas fuel vehicles or stoves to anything to reduce the use of fossil fuels overall, maybe changing your commuting times. It's one benefit of those of us who can work from home. Of course, we're really using our community impact. Using our voice so we can advocate to our community, our decision makers at all levels that, hey, this is real, we need to make a difference. And advocating at all levels, whether it's for disaster risk preparedness, getting a solar power to our streetlights, reducing, convincing restaurants, for instance, to reduce or eliminate single-use plastics, which are a huge use or consumer of fossil fuels. So a lot of the tools that Zonta Says Now has pulled together that we are developing both at the international level and trying to spread the word through podcasts similar to this, or as we call them, think tanks. And also at the US level, the USA Caucus has had a series of Zoom calls that talked about these issues such as water, disaster preparedness, and so on. Again, providing tools and understanding of how we can actually take on the issues of climate change and not feel overwhelmed by all of the issues that we're facing.
Do you feel on this, and it's a big challenge for everybody, right? For countries, for individuals. Do you feel that some people get on board with this quicker than others? Now, my children are much more open to making changes. I have one child who only wants to live in the city because then he can take public transportation if he needs to or walk. So do you feel that there's a generational difference on acceptance here and making these types of changes that we need?
I imagine there is a generational issue. There's also certainly there are some that I've encountered in our district who say this is a partisan issue because they do perceive it to be for and against a political party or the stands within a political party. But climate change affects everyone. Women belong to all political interests. And so it is a nonpartisan issue. It is political because it affects policy, but it's not partisan. So we're all in the same boat. As someone says, we're all in in the same storm, but we have different boats.
Right.
And we need to recognize how we can help those who are more limited in their opportunities and resources, particularly lower income communities or areas, women that are challenged and some resources are also just are hit more by extreme heat or air pollution and so on. That the opportunities we have there really do vary from place to place, but we can find ways to address those challenges.
I would imagine going out and doing presentations, you mentioned living by example, right? Zontians live by example. But where would you suggest somebody who's listening and they want to get involved, like, what do you expect them to do? What would you like to see them do? Doing a presentation, talking about putting together a bug out bag? And those things cost money as well. So that's something that we have to address, or women have to, not just women, anybody, but women in particular, since they tend to have less income available. And then if you have a climate event, you have even less income available. For example, in Florida, they wiped out Fort Myers Beach entirely.
Yes.
Yeah. So how do you, first of all, suggest that somebody who isn't part of Zonta get this information out, get involved? And then how do we address the cost factor?
Well, there's a huge amount of resources, of course, online. And one of the key aspects is go to recognized scientifically based resources. When you search on climate change, there's one website in particular, which I choose not to name, that always comes up at number one, but they are climate deniers. And yet, because of the Google search, they always come up one. There is a lot NASA information for scientific information. There's a lot of reliable sources out there and organizations that can provide good, objective, nonpartisan information and scientifically based, and also that provide avenues for support. There's a number of really good books out there you can find in your public library. In fact, I was just looking through the catalog in our regional library here, and they probably have 20 books specifically dealing with climate change on a range of aspects, including the real positive ones are saying, yes, we can do these things, and here are some actions that we can take. Again, on a smaller level as individuals, again, seek out reliable sources of information, do some homework, and talk to others who seem to be knowledgeable and objective on the issues and are engaged in the issue in the community. And then start saying, okay, what is doable? Should I plant some trees in my yard or help my community plant more trees? Find ways to reduce the heat island effect around your home and your community by reducing how much concrete and pavement we have and increasing vegetation. Painting your things white, especially here in the South. It's been a long tradition of having white roofs and light colored buildings that don't absorb heat.
I didn't even think about that. I have to tell you, that's like, I didn't even think about that. The color of, the house or the roof. I wouldn't have, that's really cool. I wouldn't have even thought about that, but you're right. When you go into the islands, to reduce the heat. They are. They're not painted dark colors. They don't have dark roofs. They have light roofs.
Yeah.
Sorry, didn't mean to interrupt. It just took me by surprise.
Right. Simple things of anything that can increase shade, increase vegetation, reduce things that will absorb heat, like dark colored roofs, concrete, pavement, aspects like that. Vegetation will transpire, will basically release water, through evaporation of their leaves, so they are naturally cooling. They also provide shade, which is really important, especially as we're looking at these extreme heat waves around the world. They're affecting everybody. And so how can we reduce the heat? In your home, pull your shades in the before it gets hot. And overnight when it's coolest, open your windows to let your home cool down. Anything to reduce that. Maybe increase your, during your air conditioning, increase the temperature you sit at so you don't use quite as much energy. And in the wintertime, for those of us here, keep your temperature a little bit lower, like at 65 or 68, instead of having to use so much energy. Think about changing out, if you can afford it, from your natural gas or fuel oil, go to a heat pump. Where there are federal programs that can help defray the cost of those things.
That was going to be my next question. I always wanted solar panels on the roof.
Yes.
So living in Cleveland, except for recently, we don't always have a lot of sunlight in comparison to other parts of the country. But I understand it still works, but it's pretty expensive to do. And it would be nice if we could have programs that would help with that.
Yeah. There are more federal programs. Again, that's a policy issue. Can we work with our local and state and federal policymakers, decision makers, and those who are looking at the budget? As in our new Infrastructure Reduction Act that was passed in the last federal budget, that does provide a lot of funding for communities and individuals to put in solar panels and improve wind farms and things like that, increasing the speed at which we can transition away from fossil fuels. My community up here, we have a electric cooperative, and 5 years ago or more, I guess about 5 years ago, they had an opportunity through the electric co-op for us to invest $1,000 each, and then to establish a small solar farm right next to their facilities. It has expanded and is increasingly able to balance out the use of coal-fired electricity that we have to use in our county. So it's one of the ways our local electric supplier can, through individual support, state support, federal support, can increase their solar and wind farms, is through contributions like that.
Many communities have recycling, but there's been information recently that's been out there that says, even if you are competent in putting yourself, separating things the way they're supposed to be, that a lot of that recycling is still going into landfills. Is there something that we can do to ensure that? I have a garage full of recycling, and we only get to recycle every 2 weeks. And I have a lot of neighbors who don't do it, and the answer is, well, it's going to a landfill anyways.
Right. I heard that too.
Yeah, that is really frustrating. I've been recycling for years, even back in the 1970s. I remember collecting tin and aluminum, and back then newspaper. In fact, I remember hearing about when it was a recycling day that someone was going around and stealing the newspaper stacks. There was a market for it back then. And of course, cardboard, I think there is actually a fair market, but that is the challenge, is a market for recyclables has really changed. And our capacity for recycling is really poor. So again, we need to, through consumer pressure, we can make a difference to say we want things that are reusable, recyclable. And one thing, again, you reduce single-use plastics. If you can buy things in glass, of course, glass doesn't always get recycled either. but that's something you can reuse, reduce single-use plastics in any way you can, and try to find a way through our opportunity as consumers to say, hey, we want things to be more sustainable in the long term. How we address the challenge of recyclables is really challenging. Can we find products that are made for like decking? I just had to replace my back deck, and I used that material that is used or made from a lot of plastic bags. So there's one really simple example. Don't take plastic bags from the grocery store. They are really handy for a lot of secondary uses, but I have probably a dozen cloth bags that always wander around the back of my car that I'm pretty good at remembering to bring into the store every time.
Well, we used to bring it in, and then COVID hit, and then they wouldn't allow you to take anything in.
Right.
So we had to start to relearn to carry them all over. But I think it's a tough balance for the average person. They try to do what they can do, but first of all, there's a convenience factor. The plastics, it's convenient. You pick up your food, you go. We live in this microwave quick society. So people want to grab it and go. They're not prepping meals. They're not doing those things. They're not composting. They're not reusing. They want to do it and be done. And then the second issue I believe for a lot of people is the money involved. Because let's say you plant more plants, so you have more green, but it's hot. You have to water. What happens then? Your water bill goes up. And in some areas, they don't allow you to water your plants, depending on what's going on in that area. So I think there's such a fine line balance, especially for somebody who's, just the average Joe. Financially, there are people who could do whatever they need to do. They're not always the one that are doing it either. But the average Joe person like myself, every day I have to balance. Do I want to pay for this? I know it's, helps a small local farmer. Does this, or do you get, your money's limited, or do you get this because it's faster and it's cheaper and you do have to feed your family? So that to me is the true piece that we have to find a way to address.
Yeah, for the average citizen, especially if you don't have access or space, for your own garden, be able to grow at least a few vegetables. That is one of my areas of concern in the long term. Not so much long term future is the impact of changing climate on our food resources.
Right.
Because between extreme heat and some other extreme weather events, our food supplies are going to be hit in different ways, and that's really going to cause a lot of social and economic disruption around the world. But how can a average individual of limited income make a difference? One is sort of going back to what our grandparents and parents and my parents learned during the 30s. Reuse, reduce, reuse, don't buy a lot of new clothes frequently, and reuse, reduce, recycle, repurpose as much as possible. But the way our society does work, fast fashion, where there's new clothes styles coming out every month. We need to somehow break that cycle, and stay with the similar clothes, reduce how many clothings that we buy and then toss out, or take to thrift stores, which end up getting tossed out. Recycling our food better, composting where we can, getting our communities perhaps to have composting programs. So part of this is not only up to the individual, but also having the individual working their community to say, I can't do this alone, but if we do it as a community project, like improving solar lighting in our community, having a composting opportunity, community gardens, ways that the individual can still be making a difference, but be part of a greater power.
The other thing is teaching younger people to do those things. I grew up in the country. We had a garden. We canned. We made our own wine from the fruit and the trees and the grapes, and so we did all of that. My children grew up in a very affluent neighborhood, but I made them garden, and I made them pull weeds, and they were so mad at me because they said, Mom, nobody else in the neighborhood does this. They have people to do that. Well, I wanted them to learn so that they knew, just like I've always had a garden. Even now, I can't have one in the yard, but I can do it on the patio. So I
Right.
do patio tomatoes and I do herbs that way. I think we have a whole group of people who don't have a clue on how to do this because they never needed to.
Right.
And you brought up like your parents and what you've learned. Also, our products are made to break.
Yes.
We made things to last and we passed it on. I remember our refrigerator was my grandparents' refrigerator, and we used it my whole life till I moved out at 18. I think my mother had it until, I think she probably had it about 20 years. My grandfather had it about 20 years. You don't have that anymore. Things don't last 2 years. So we have a very disposable society. And that's a systemic issue because of business. You want to sell, you want to make money. So you got to
Right.
have it break, because if it lasts forever, you're not making money.
Right.
We're never going to solve it just in this, 40 minutes on show. But I do think that that's what puts the defeat idea in people. It's like, oh my gosh, well, I can't do this because first of all, I can't save everything. And believe me, I had depression grandparents. I became a saver. And I am learning to not do that in a reasonable manner. So for example, I've been cleaning out things, had a large house, had to downsize over time, had medical challenges, had to downsize. But I didn't throw it out like everyone tells me to do. Get a dumpster, throw it out. Nope. I donated my books so that kids can have books in the city. I found a great place where you can donate your clothing. And then what they don't use, they take to a textile location to reuse them. I mean, the same thing where I donated my books. If they can't use them and can't find a new home for that, they take them to a publisher who, figures out a way to reuse.
Mhm.
That's what I think we need, that type of information to be out.
Yes.
Groups, as you pointed out, we work together with other groups. I picked organizations that are nonprofit, but also work with other nonprofits to make sure. And it takes a lot of work, I have to admit. It's taken me tons of time, and I have more to go.
Right.
But I can sleep at night knowing that I haven't just filled the garbage dump with things that people can use. I have a friend sending the clothes to Nigeria. They send clothes every year. She said, give me a couple of bags. So I know that somebody across the world is going to say, I love those leggings you had or those t-shirts. So I think we have to look at it globally, as Zonta does. But I think we have to figure out a way to deal with that undercurrent of, the idea that we can't make a difference because.
Right. We live so much in a fast environment in North America of convenience. Our speed limits have gone up and up and up.
Mhm.
If we just, slowed down 5 miles, 10 miles an hour, we'd save a lot of fuel. We expect be able to have instant food. Our work lives have definitely changed, and expectations of speed. It's benefited a lot from technology like Zoom and in the internet for finding information, but our lives have just gotten to expect these things compared to the skills and time that we had before. But I was reading a biography of Gaylord Nelson, who was the both governor and senator from Wisconsin, and he is the father of Earth Day. And what was really interesting in that book was not only did he have the vision of Earth Day in 1970, and it blew up. It just came at a time when everybody was ready for something to happen. And it just became a life on it of its own, because there was the information such as Rachel Carson's Silent Spring. We had rivers that were burning. We had a lot of pollution. People were becoming aware of the crises that were facing us. And when Earth Day hit, there was something like over 100,000 schools had Earth Day programs, colleges programs. There were protests, and it was an organic from the event and groundswell from grassroots up that said, we need to make a difference. And in the 1970s, we passed at the federal level, and I think in many states, passed legislation that said we need to protect the environment, the Clean Air Act, the Clean Water Act, other things that made a huge difference in how we took care of our earth. I think we're at the same place now. We have the increasing knowledge and awareness and concern that we need to develop those same grassroots efforts that go upward, and the citizens tell their decision makers, we need a difference, we need to change, and we can do it. And it's amazing what we did in the 70s. We really changed the trajectory of the nation when it came to taking care of the environment. We need to do that, and I think we are doing that globally, but it's beginning to roll. And unfortunately, climate may be changing faster than we are, but we are poised, I think, really to make a difference. But again, coming together in organizations at the community level, at the larger levels, not whether you're nonprofits, you may maybe start local clubs to figure out where are those resources in your community. But you got to be talking to your decision makers who ultimately change the policies that will help us to deal with what's going to be hitting us with climate change and ultimately reducing our fossil fuels.
It's interesting if we had continued what we started, because I'm an earth child. I was like a young hippie back in the days, some people would say. And I was big into Earth Day, and we had school programs and we had those into college. And then all of a sudden, it kind of waned. Still there, but it waned. Right. And I think a lot of it, again, was convenience factor. The world changed. Those individuals grew up and became more focused on business and a larger home and that kind of area versus what they were when they were younger. So those individuals who are the boomers of today, right, need to step up because they have the resources to make a difference, whereas some of the younger people do not, but hopefully have the drive. It's interesting. You have a whole group that's like, it's too much work for me. Somebody else will do it. It's too much work for me. And then you have a group that, like my son, who really wants to live in a location where he makes a better footprint, or leaves less of a footprint. So I think if anybody's watching this, the challenge is in your area, how do you pull this together so that you make a change? Start one thing. One thing can make a difference. And a lot of people don't believe that. One vote makes a difference. And so I think besides the political piece to this, the policy piece to this, I think it's looking at your church groups, your social groups. What can we pull together to do something? And then try to get back to our boomer generation. And it occurred to me, I had a couple ideas while we're talking, because I do a lot of nonprofit work locally besides Zonta. I think I'm going to hit up with some of the local magazine groups and say, how can we bring this out in an article that hits that generation?
Yeah,
so
bring it up.
Listening, and you got those ideas, follow up with them, use them.
Right. And be able to provide those ideas, those tools. How can we reduce our use of single-use plastics? When you go to a restaurant, bring your own
straw.
Your own straw, but also bring, if you want to bring leftovers home, bring your own container.
We have a Zontian that does that. Everybody laughs, and then she goes, well, I had some extra. I'm bringing that for you too. Right. So you're not using the styrofoam. Right. A lot of people have gone back to that. I don't know if anybody's noticed that, because it's cheaper than getting paper.
Yeah.
The box.
Yeah. Yeah, it's one of the challenges. But having, working in your community and through social media, through public media, or just sharing information, as you say, through church groups, other groups, our hiking group here where I live, just share ideas. How can you make a difference? How can we work together to make a difference?
Right, right. Well, I really appreciate you being on. Third time was the charm.
Absolutely.
Even today, I had a couple of challenges getting on, and then a phone ringing. I don't think that's ever happened to me, ever. My last one, my dog barked. That doesn't happen either. So, but that's okay. You know that we're not re-editing this program.
Right.
We want you to hear the information as it comes out, all the ideas. So thank you for being on, Jane. Thanks for talking about Zonta. And before we go, if someone wants to look into Zonta and what we're doing with climate change, how would they find that information?
You go to zonta.org, zonta.org. And under causes, one of the tabs pull down is the Zonta says now for gender equal climate action. It's a starting point for information. And there's also the USA Caucus, Zonta USA Caucus group that has additional information about what we can do in terms of climate education, advocacy, and collaboration.
Sounds
All right.
wonderful.
Thank you again, Jane. Everyone, thanks for tuning in. One person can make a difference. Make it be you.
Absolutely. Have a
Thanks.
great day.
Bye.